Okay, so here's my continued rundown of the Fables of Jesus and the Gospel of Luke. Here talking about the second book. I put it in full screen mode, so you don't have to see all the tabs and everything I have open. I don't know if this is better or worse because now you can only see one page at a time, but we'll give this a shot. So, book two, this is where we take all of the knowledge that we've gained, again, that no one really until now has known about from book one, and apply it then specifically to the fables of Jesus, looking at the narrative parables through the fable lens, through multiple different avenues. So the first thing I do in the very first chapter is start about how this interpretation worked before Adolf Ulicker. So this is important because, as I mentioned in the last video, Adolf Ulicker, who wrote his books around 1899, is often considered to be the founder of parable scholarship. And that was the last major work to discuss this idea of the relevance of fables to Jesus's narrative parables. But as I show, Ulicker wasn't really the father. He was more of the fulcrum from previous scholarship. Scholarship, for example, that was published in academic Latin that scholars today really can't access anymore. And as it turns out, before Ulicker, it was pretty common that critical biblical scholars would think about Jesus's fables as fables. And in fact, a lot of the myths that people believe about fables today are in a sense kind of parroted by what you could say would be the conservative scholars from the 1800s or so, who would talk about fables are only about talking animals, or fables are vulgar, or so on. Anyway, so I go through the period before Ulicker to show how this earlier critical scholarship worked with this idea that the narrative parables are in fact fables. And I don't just stop at the Enlightenment and so on. I go earlier and earlier. I talk about the Middle Ages, a few authors, all the way back to Icelandic monks, some other Middle Ages figures, and so on. I'd make a short little pit stop at the Gospel of Thomas. And so again, the fable solves all kinds of mysteries about the parable, but one other one it solves is that parabole is the term used only in the Synoptic Gospels for parables, only in the Synoptic Gospels. And obviously, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are dependent on each other. So they're looking over each other's shoulder. So it's not as if they're independently using this term. The Gospel of Thomas does not use parabole at all. And the concept of parable doesn't seem to be there at all. Thomas contains a parable tradition, famously contains quite a number of what were considered parables, but doesn't use the term. And in fact, Thomas's parables look even more fable-like than the ones in Mark and Matthew. Luke's are about in the same level. Anyway, so stop there. And then at the end of the chapter, I point out not just fables, but Aesopic traditions that occur in the Gospel of Luke outside of the fables themselves, outside of the narrative parables. So Jesus quotes or alludes to other known fable examples from the Aesop tradition. I talk about how his reading of the scroll of Isaiah and the synagogue in chapter 4 looks a bit like an episode from the life of Aesop, namely this mystery about why they try to throw Jesus off of a cliff when they're in Nazareth. There's no cliffs near Nazareth, so that's a bit problematic, but a very similar episode occurs in the life of Aesop. And I also point out how a couple of recent scholars have noticed after Jesus' resurrection, when he when he talks to his disciples, he says, "Oh, foolish and slow in heart to believe everything that has been prophesied." He says this in iambic trimeter, in a line that we have paralleled with a couple fables. So this isn't something I discovered, but a couple other scholars about 5 years ago found this pretty remarkable parallel. And so we have some strong Aesopic resonances going on throughout the Gospel of Luke outside of the fables themselves. Anyway, so that then leads into chapter 9, the Gospel of Jesus and the Fable Teller. So the fable as a genre, as a number of fable scholars have noticed, has what we call a high authorial presence. That means that the author is taking part a good deal in the text itself and how it's told. And the fable genre has a couple of antipodal, you could say, opposite characterizations associated with it, namely for slaves and for sophists. And what I mean by that is the author Phaedrus, again, who lived during the days of Jesus, writing his collections, he tells us that fables were invented by slaves so that they could say what they wanted to their masters through coded speech and get away with it, more or less. It's a genre of subversive speech. This, as I argue, makes a lot of sense of Jesus's use of talking in parables in the Gospel of Mark. So that verse is not found in the Gospel of Luke for reasons I'll talk about in a moment. But in Mark, Jesus tells his fables, his parables, so that seeing they won't see, so that hearing they won't hear, and so on. So this is exactly the kind of coded language tradition that you'd find in the slave fables, like those that Phaedrus tells. On the other hand, the fable was a very handy rhetorical tool used by ancient educated people and rhetors. So in book 1, I talked about the use of fable and rhetoric, but it's especially handy if you're making an argument. So if you're a lawyer, it's often helpful to cite precedent, an event that happened similar to the one at hand. But what do you do if you can't think of a good example that happened in history? You invent one. And that is a fable. A fable is an invented story about imagined characters who, engage in some sort of thing. You tell the story in the past tense, and it applies to the situation that you're talking about at the broader meta level. And so this is an example of sophists using it. And Luke really latches on to this high-class use of the fable. So he jettisons the fable as the genre of the poor and the farmers and the slaves, and portrays Jesus as a good rhetor and educated fable teller. And a great example of this, as I show, is the Good Samaritan, where Jesus is arguing with a lawyer and then responds using a fable and out-lawyers the lawyer with a perfect rebuttal, in effect. So Jesus is an ideal teacher, rhetor, and so on in the Gospel of Luke. And then I identify the death of the fable teller tradition that I mentioned before in the first book, and how Jesus fits this typology of how fable tellers tell fables on their way to the gallows, foretell their death, and so on. And that this is something which seems to fit well, fitting Jesus into the fable tradition. Then in chapter 10, we talk about form. So form is kind of the bread and butter of biblical scholars in determining genre and how genres work and how we should interpret the biblical text. So at a very basic level, I demonstrate that the form of the fable and the form of the narrative parable are identical. So that's just a really quick overview of that, but also some particulars of the fable genre. So Luke, for example, is famous for beginning his fables with the protagonist Anthropos Tis or something like that. That is very characteristic of the ancient fable genre. I talk about soliloquy and direct speech. So when you think about the most famous examples in the Gospel of Luke, the Good Samaritan, the prodigal son, rich man Lazarus, and so on, many of Luke's characters will enter into soliloquies. This doesn't really happen in the other Gospels, but it's all over Luke. And this is, again, a good Luke showing his excellence in composing fables. Then next, I talk about how rhetors were trained, how students were trained to expand and contract fables in the prognosmata, and identify the prodigal son and the two debtors as maybe examples of this. And then chapter 11, I address some important themes that seem to be especially strong in Luke that resonate with the fable tradition. So the crafty steward has always been a puzzle. Why would Jesus praise the steward for his crafty behavior? In the fable context, this happens all the time, where you praise a weak character who outsmarts the strong character and ultimately comes out on top. So one of the big ways that parable scholarship, and you could say the conservatism of it, has gotten in the way has been the reticence to see Jesus as saying anything funny. And this is especially coming out of the 1800s when we were trying to force parables and fables to be separate. Fables could be funny, but parables could not because Jesus is always sad and somber and so on. And so this section talks about how there's pretty obvious comedy that we have not been wanting to see in the fables of Jesus, using the example of the judge and the widow. And then finally, in this chapter, I talk about the impossibility of the fable and the possibility of the parable. So here I identify, especially that in Luke, several of his so-called parables are impossible, unrealistic stories. So we already just saw the widow threatens to punch the judge in the face. In the rich fool, in Luke chapter 12, you have a God appearing, which is obviously impossible and miraculous. Rich man and Lazarus, also you have these kinds of scenarios. And so I set the rich fool, which has the God appearing, alongside of some other fables that are just about other foolish farmers, and show that, in fact, in this case, the so-called parable is the unrealistic one. At chapter 12 and chapter 13 deal with how our knowledge of the fable from the first century helps us to understand how to interpret the parables of Jesus. So it's long been thought that parables are supposed to have one single lesson. This is actually an idea that's based in fable theory of the 1800s and 1700s that was brought into parable scholarship. And then parable scholars basically just forgot about the fable and don't realize that that's where it came from. So here I go through basically how fables were interpreted in the first century and show how this works then in the Gospel of Luke. So in chapter 12, I introduce how this all works. And then chapter 13, I then begin to apply it to specific examples. So the judge and the widow, the Pharisee and the tax collector, the crafty steward, and so on and so forth. Chapter 14 and 15 are in the back because I think they're probably the hardest to get through. So here I'm advancing a theory that that specialists of Luke have often advanced, namely that Luke's parables come from a parable collection. So in the overview lecture that I gave, I showed you an outline of Luke, and you'll see that Luke is not like Mark or Matthew, who cram all their fables together in one chapter. Luke spaces them out one chapter at a time. He'll give an example, one fable after the other in chapter 10, chapter 11, 12, 13, 14, and so on. And then what scholars have also noted is that many of Luke's narrative parables, his fables, will have phrases that reference each other. So the friend at midnight in chapter 11 has a almost identical phrase with the judge and the widow in chapter 18. And how do we explain this sort of thing? What purpose would that serve? So as I show, ancient fable collections would often do this. They would link fables together, make them mirror each other in different ways. And basically what I do is I take this theory that Luke had a parable collection and try to give it new life by basically saying, all you do is change the word parable to fable as a fable collection, and we know a lot about how fable collections were composed, organized, and so on and so forth. And basically then make that comparison to show that this is actually a fairly plausible theory that Luke had a fable collection of Jesus' fables that he incorporates into his gospel along the way. Chapter 15, I then go into excruciating philological detail to work out how this all works in a source critical way. And then finally, in chapter 16, I look beyond the Gospel of Luke to talk about the other early Christian and Jewish materials. So obviously, the book is long enough as it is. So that's one very practical reason why I did the Gospel of Luke. But the implications are also there for Matthew, Q, Mark, John, Paul, Thomas, and so on. So there's obvious direct fable parallels in the Gospel of Matthew, and so on and so forth. And then historical Jesus is also there. So there's been a review in RBL who astutely noted that I don't tackle the historical Jesus problem so much. But obviously, I mean, people are interested in how this affects our understanding of historical Jesus. And one way is that if you assume that everything goes back to Jesus because no one else is telling parables, well, that can no longer be your basis of making this argument, because it's in fact a ubiquitous genre that everybody is using. In fact, that the evangelists all knew how to use and knew how to redact and compose and so on and so forth. So I'll be working more on that in the future. So basically that summarizes the book, but I also would not neglect the indexes here. So down here in the index of Fables, which you should be able to access free online, I give page after page list, a humongous list of the ancient fables, hundreds of them, so that you can check out what the ancient fable lists look like and see where I reference those. So that's a rundown of the book. I'm sure I maybe skipped some interesting things, or maybe things that you want to know about. So feel free to ask about that as well. So I will stop sharing this now.